So part of the challenge right now is that we are live streaming this primarily so that we'll have a recording that we can share with members of the Black Philadelphians Descendant community group who are unable to be here today. But also, as long as we're recording it, we figure we might as well try and share it with others. And I know that there are folks tuning in who are part of this work already, as well as others who are interested. So thank you for being here. And also thank you for your patience with the technology as we kind of try and navigate it all together. So I think that the feedback issue is solved now, and hopefully everything else will work. Great. If you're just coming in, there's a handout on the back chair. Want to grab one? So my name is Lyra.d.monteiro, and I have a background in anthropology. I was trained as an archaeologist at NYU and the University of Michigan and Brown, and but most of my academic career has been within American Studies and History departments. And I think that that's kind of giving me a different kind of a perspective on a lot of things in connection with how anthropology functions. And so I want to just kind of give that as a bit of context for myself and for the work that I do. And thank you again all for being here today while we talk about our work, specifically, as the title says, around anthropological praxis and descendant community organizing for the Return of Ancestral Remains at Penn Museum. It feels especially important to us to be here at this conference today. Our project is not an academic project. We don't present at academic conferences, but it feels important for us to be here today because in the context of the AAA's Commission on the Ethical Treatment of Remains report, which of course is just recently been released and was all shared at a feedback session at this conference. That commission was a product of really the same events that our work, that Finding Ceremony is a product of, namely what came out about the Penn Museum in April of 2021 and their treatment of ancestral remains. And whereas that grew from within the institution, that commission grew from within the institution, this project grows from outside of the institution. And one of the things that I really like to offer to think about today is something that came up in this listening session on Wednesday. Sorry, it wasn't a listening session, but when we shared the report and received feedback, particularly that Jenny Davis in particular talked about, right, which was the problem of how often it is the case that when it comes to NAGPRA, the most common context in which community remains are returned within anthropology departments, how commonly it is the case that the buck keeps on getting passed, right? That nobody wants to take responsibility for it. Nobody sees it as it's their job to do it. Right? Everyone has an excuse as to why it's not their responsibility. But a lot of it really comes, and a lot of it comes down to, well, I didn't do it. I didn't collect these records. It's somebody before me did that, so I can't hold them responsible. And so then you might end up with almost nobody, and the pace at which we're all very familiar with the pace at which the has happened under NAGPRA and mostly not happened, right? In the past over 30 years now. So one thing that Finding Ceremony, not intentionally, this is what we set out to do, but one thing that I think it can offer anthropologists is to think about, well, what if the work doesn't need to be done or shouldn't be done within the academy at all? Right? What if it shouldn't be done within the institutions that have historically caused the harm by collecting, by doing research on these ancestral remains to begin with? What if that work can and should be done outside of the academy? And what would that look like? So as a discipline, and this is something that I very much appreciate having spent so much time around historians, anthropology is admirable for its self-awareness and for its open discussion of its racist and colonial origins. Not a thing historians do. But even at the graduate level, the narrative that one learns about the origins of anthropology is that they are firmly related in the past, those racist and colonial origins. And that his heroic figures such as Mead and Boaz, now even termed anti-racist by some, lifted anthropology out of its racist past, and that today any issues that exist within the discipline are those of this very moment, and not those that we've inherited from the past in a very material way. Critiques of anthropology are overwhelmingly focused on future action, particularly future fieldwork. How do we not continue to be exploitative in our engagement with the people we study? How do we support more graduate students in studying their own cultures? How do I make my fieldwork less destructive? What ethical standards can we use to establish what ethical standards can we establish for caring for human remains? But it's not enough for anthropology to say, sorry, I'll do better next time. Because the harm the field has done to colonized people and the empires that it's propped up cannot be addressed by a more thoughtful research design. And this harm is, of course, nowhere more evident than in the material reality related to the hundreds of thousands of Native American remains that have been held in museums, and many of which are still held by universities around the country, as well as tens of thousands of other racialized and marginalized people. Now, when something happens, like what happened at the Penn Museum the first time that there were the remains of a child murdered in the bombing in the Penn Museum in 2021, or when this past January, when the director of the museum secretly buried 19 people from the Mormon collection against the objections of community members. I feel like I often see anthropologists react to that kind of news with a lot of self-congratulatory concern and disgust and distancing themselves, right? Like, that's them, that's not me. And ultimately, I really think that the responsibility for this massive, basically the massive collections of human remains that are in the basement of so many museums and so many universities is the responsibility of everyone in anthropology. Not just because, of course, none of us, very few of us have been responsible for collecting them, right? But that's not the point. Anthropology as a discipline grows out of that work, right? So in a way, all of our careers are built on top of those bones. That said, just because anthropology is responsible for dealing with human remains and this issue doesn't mean that anthropologists have the capacity to do it. Okay? And I'd like to make a comparison here as to what I mean with the summer of 2020. So the summer of 2020 forced many liberal white people to face the reality of the untenability of white innocence by which they had been living their non-racist lives. Similarly, I think it's past time to replace the anthropological innocence claimed by those who work in fields that don't involve human beings, and instead face clearly the realities of this disciplinary legacy, because these issues are everyone's responsibility. And here I think there's a parallel lesson for the shattering of anthropological innocence, which is to consider whether or not you have the capacity to address the harm that you've caused without causing further harm. Back in 2020, there were a lot of white people who discovered racism for the first time and brought all of their big feelings and desires to be helpful and inserted themselves and their whiteness into spaces where they didn't belong, and particularly into positions of leadership that they didn't belong in response to this newfound shattering of their anthropological innocence. Similarly, I think that a department and a museum, Penn Anthropology Department, Penn Museum, and the University of Pennsylvania, that can cause harm to the degree that they have in the past 3 years, and ultimately longer than that, of course, has demonstrated that they lack the capacity to ethically return the human remains in their own basement. Based solely on their response to the public revelation that they held remains from the MOVE bombing, and which I'll talk a little bit more about, the Penn Museum and the University of Pennsylvania have shown it again and again that they cannot be relied on to understand what the right thing is, much less to do it. And that's really the concern out of which the work that we're doing emerged. So I want to kind of quickly go through the timeline of our work. And you have a timeline written out in full on the back of your handout. I won't be talking about each moment of this in detail, but you will be able to find details for pretty much everything that took place up until the summer of 2023, is covered in this article, this journal article. So you can find a lot more information there. But I do want to at least give some context for, what we're talking about when we talk about the main focus of finding ceremonies work, as well as some of the key moments that have led to the creation of finding ceremony. Before I turn it over, so we can hear from our panelists, who each of whom is part of finding ceremony in a different way and brings a different perspective to the work. So, just to first give some context on what the Morton Cranial Collection is. It's a collection of approximately 1,300 crania that were mostly collected by the Philadelphia physician Samuel George Morton in the 1830s and the 1840s. And, this is probably familiar to a lot of folks who are anthropologists, but just to remind ourselves, that's literally the collection we're talking about, right? Those are the ancestors that we're talking about. They're the people from whom that data was extracted, right? And which was then used to oppress their descendants, okay? So it's both the violence of the theft and also of how the research was performed and what was done with it. That collection came to the Penn Museum in 1966. And we don't actually know the exact number of the collection. I imagine that that Rachel Watkins, who is now in charge of that collection, will be finding the exact number. But it's really quite striking that we're in 2024 now, and we still don't know how many skulls still exist within this collection. They continue to be used after Morton's death and borrowed by people, including by the US, for their own research. So, it's unclear which of them may have survived in the museum. Something I want to really emphasize is the scope of the collection. This probably, again, won't be much of a surprise to folks familiar with Morton's work. But all of the places that are in blue are modern nation states from whose territory ancestors were taken. So we're talking about a massive, massive scope. And this map is also important for explaining partly why I am here, right? And why this is of interest to me personally. A lot of the emphasis has been on the crania of enslaved Black people that were in the collection, and that is not my own background, right? But a number of the crania in the collection are also from South Asia, which is where my father's family is from. And so as a scholar approaching this collection and this issue, I've always approached it from the perspective of someone who identifies as a descendant community member and also seeks the return of those ancestors. So the collection was at Penn pretty much without much comment or concern for a very long time. That changed in 2019. And really, everything that we now know about happening at the museum, that shift really can be traced to 2015. In terms of it becoming something that came out of the university's own conversations and into the public sphere. And that's thanks actually to our panelist and my co-convener with my ceremony, who learned for the first time about the Cuban crania that were on display in the classroom in the basement of the Penn Museum, and demanded the return of them, right? And from there, that cry ended up being taken up the following summer in 2020 by a number of people within Penn's community. We amplified aAliy's demand. And by 2021, April 2021, the museum apologized for its unethical possession, in their words, of the Morton Cranial Collection and promised to try to return all of it, which was a huge, huge step, right? As we think about how often NAGPRA is the only context in which these returns happen in the United States. It was a huge step, and for people like me on the outside observing, we had a lot of curiosity about, wow, how is Penn going to manage that? Like, how will that happen? How will that process of return happen? And these are headlines from a couple of other op-eds that aAliy wrote that year, because it was in the context of that organizing, the organizing of the Morton Collection, and specifically Black Philadelphians remains in the Morton Collection, that aAliy was approached by someone who shared with them the knowledge of the information that the museum held remains of children who were murdered in the bombing. This was all before I was involved in things on the ground. I was involved once we started in 2022 and obtained additional documents, including some that had been aware of evidence that had been available within the Department of Anthropology, but they refused to allow it to become public back in April 2021, that proved that Penn had remains of Delicia Africa as well, not just those of Patricia Johnson, Tree Africa, that were returned in April 2021. And of course, last week, the museum acknowledged that they found Delicia Africa's remains. And to be clear, that was a senior thesis that was written in the University of Pennsylvania's Department of Anthropology, in which the Anthropology Department refused to allow people to have access to, which had x-rays of those remains, of Delicia's remains, as well as the writing, within the narrative of the dissertation of the thesis discussion, the fact that the remains of 2 new children at the museum. I state that because, if that had been published in April of 2021, her family and community would not have had to suffer for 3.5 years without knowing, or rather with the knowledge that those bones must be in the museum, but they hadn't been returned, and the museum refused to acknowledge that they had. Also in 2022, the Penn Museum tried to carry out a secret burial of what they described as at least 13 Black Philadelphians, whose remains were in the Morton Cranial Collection. And this was something that we found out about, that myself and aAliy found out about, and we filed objections to the process. That was the process that you had to do within the orphans court process that Penn was going through. And that was enough to stop the burials from moving. And that's pretty much, in some ways, really kind of the origin point of finding ceremony. aAliy and I had met when I was researching the article that I showed at the front of the top of this presentation, and realized that despite coming from extremely different backgrounds in every way imaginable, we really shared a clear sense of what we thought needed to happen when it came to the return of human remains that are held in these collections. And so coming out of this, we ended up forming a mailing list. So anyone who's on the mailing list for Finding Ceremony, that's where that starts. So a number of people, about 50 people, signed a letter that was sent to the judge in support of our objections as well. But Penn ultimately what did receive approval from the judge to bury what by then they were saying 20 Black Philadelphians in the Morton Cranial Collection. And it was as part of that process we came up with our first proposal for what shape we proposed that Finding Ceremony could take. In other words, that practical reality of what would it look like if people outside of the institution were to be in charge of taking care of their own ancestors. Right? What would that look like? How would we do that? And who would pay for it? Well, the answer to that was really clear for us: the institution that had caused the harm. Right? When you think about it, they were paying for the work internally, anyways. So that was where we first came to articulate this project that we're now calling Finding Ceremony. I'm going to read this briefly. This is from an op-ed that we wrote for Sapiens in May of 2023. In response to the historical subjugation and desecration of ancestral remains by museums and universities, we proposed to the court a descendant community-controlled process called Finding Ceremony. The proposal for this, by the way, is on our website. I think also linked to it somewhere. When we say Finding Ceremony, we mean restoring the lineages of care, reverence, and spiritual memory to the work of caring for our dead. We understand, as 2 members of different descendant communities reflected in the human collections at Penn, Harvard, and elsewhere, that the colonial violence that situated our ancestors as collected and collective cranium means that our work is tied together. In other words, if you think back to that map, right, aAliy and I don't represent all of the places that are on that map. And even as we've grown to include more people, we still don't represent all of the communities that have been impacted by this. But we do see it as being a collective experience that's shared by those whose ancestors were taken. And so like a collective descendant community body, not to make decisions, about what happens with the ancestors, because that would be inappropriate, but to care for them outside of the context of the institution that had done them harm. So today, and this all came together pretty quickly in 2023, Finding Ceremony is a descendant-led reparations project for the return of ancestral collections, remains, and museum collections. It has 2 co-conveners, myself and Ali Mohammed. There's a Black Philadelphians descendant community group, and that's the only descendant community group that we have right now. And that group only exists now without funding, without proper support, but it exists because of the urgency and the necessity of how Penn was targeting the needs of Black Philadelphians at that moment and to this day. It also has an archival research team and a genealogical research team, some representatives, including myself, from those research teams here as well. We also have a network of advisors and a mailing list of over 400 people who are also following this work. All right, this intro is taking longer than I was expecting it to, but I think it's probably worth sharing the core principles still. Yeah, all right. Thank you for bearing with me. Okay, also our website for everything. Okay, so I do want to share our core principles, and because I think this really helps to clarify what is possible and what is necessary, and in some ways what seems obvious, I think, to a lot of people who are not anthropologists, to a lot of people who aren't used to the idea that museums and universities hold ancestral remains, right, and think that that's okay, that's normal to continue. The first of these is, number 1, that the Penn Museum and the University of Pennsylvania have no decision-making role in the process of returning the ancestors. So we're not talking about collaboration or cooperation or consultation. No decision-making role. As perpetrators of the harm, they cannot be part of the healing, other than through funding the work. 2, there are no easy or ideal or even very good solutions to the question of how to return the ancestors in the Morton cranial collection. This is key, right? Because whenever people say, oh, it's really complicated. Well, yes, of course it's complicated. This is a violent colonial mess, over 200 years in the making, right? This is not easy. This is not simple. This is because, and as it says, this is because we live in a world that empire has made with the help of Morton's racial science. A world that has intentionally severed the ties of family and homelands of both the living and the dead. While it may be possible to identify direct lineal descendants for some of the people whose skulls were stolen and trafficked across the world, it is unlikely that we will be able to do that for everyone. And I can say that since we wrote this, we now know that it is possible to identify students. 3, given the absence of good solutions, Finding Ceremony proposes that a group of people who are deeply concerned about the afterlives of ancestors serve as a stewardship body who can care for the ancestors who have been held at the Penn Museum until the best group of people gather to decide what to do with any part of the Morton collection that they recognize to be their ancestors. I'm not really defining descendant community throughout this introduction. I think anthropologists are fairly familiar with that concept as defined by Dr. Michael Blakey, to which we all owe an immense debt. Thank you. And this work really is, I'm seeing other shades of how that can play out in this work, right? One of which is through this collective idea of, I'm not from a lot of the places where the skulls of the Morton cranial collection are from, but it's not in the same way that with descendant community, you can't appoint someone to be a member of a descendant community, right? They have to feel that, they have to be called to do that work. Right? Until there is somebody who is called to do that work, I can at least be part of making sure that those ancestors are not further harmed. Does that make sense? As someone who identifies as part of that more collective descendant community from the Morton cranial collection specifically. Another thing that I've learned in doing this work is how descendant community, in that sense of like being called to do the work and it choosing you rather than you choosing it, right? Or rather than assigned to do it or appointed to do it, is also very true for those who have shown up to support those who are caring for their own ancestors. So on this panel, I'm thinking about myself and Lauren, who are not Black Philadelphians, who are not members of the Black Philadelphians Descendant community group, but we are among a couple dozen people who are actively working on those research teams to help them identify their ancestors. And it's an incredible group of really dedicated people meeting every couple of weeks to do this on their own time. Right? So I do think that that's an interesting way for us to have that can kind of expand out in concentric circles from the close group that has been called to do the work of caring for their own ancestors. I already mentioned that this is the idea that this is a reparations project. The university, they certainly have the money if it's something that they decide that is important to do. And then I'll just quickly jump up to some more present day things, the more current things. Last August, we found some photographs on Flickr that made very clear that Janet Mont had displayed over a dozen fragments of the remains of bombing victims to the public at a public International Archaeology Day event. There are many Penn faculty and staff visible at the same event in these photos. And so the idea that this was not something that, I mean, we all know that the department knew, but this is, you know, additional evidence. And also extremely importantly, underneath that black box that you can't see there, are those remains, including very prominently some of Delicia's remains, or elements that correspond to what we know about Delicia. In the museum, we've never seen photos before. And again, the Penn Museum ignored this completely. The director just dismissed it, they didn't respond. So another instance of that happening. Also, as I mentioned, many of you know, back in January, the Penn Museum, despite objections from the community and also from scientists externally about how they were disregarding concepts around descendant and best practices around descendant community, the Penn Museum did bury 19 people. The reason why they didn't bury the 20th will probably come up in our presentations, which isn't really a triumph, right? It's a triumph, but it's also an extremely violent action that they did that. And also, you know, that they didn't deaccession them either. All of those remains, all of the remains in the Morton Crater collection are still part of the Morton Crater collection. I've emphasized this quote from the director of the museum there. We're not giving them away, we're not transferring them, we're not burying them underground and making them inaccessible. This, for us, is where these individuals should be right now as a matter of appropriate storage. Yeah, he's referring to putting people in a vault in the cemetery as appropriate storage. And this goes back to what I was saying about, you know, it being their responsibility. Of course, it's Penn Museum's responsibility to care for these ancestors. Do they have the capacity? I don't think so. No. Okay, so that's all I wanted to cover by way of introduction. Next, I'm going to be introducing the panelists. So I'm going to be introducing each of the panelists, and they'll each speak a bit of their work. And then I'd like to open it up for the audience if you have any questions for the panelists specifically, right, individually. And then we'll hear from our discussant. After which we'll have time for general discussion questions, okay? And we do want to save as much as possible for that. But I think it was probably important to cover this background material. Okay, so our first panelist is Jazmin Benton, whose work focuses on Black American art, history, and culture. Her interest in investigating archival traces and conversations across time has led her to curate exhibitions such as See You When I See You, Black Student Life at UCSC from 1965 to present. And it's After the End of the World, Afrofuturism and Visual Culture. In addition, she has worked in archives, libraries, and museums to support artists and researchers in their work. Her training in these areas has allowed her to help train others in the importance of autonomy over their own stories, as well as in navigating traditional archival spaces. Slide.
Hello, hi everyone, thank you for coming. As Lyra said, my name is Jazmin. I'm currently a member of the Black Philadelphian Civic Community Group, and I also volunteer my labor with Sign and Ceremonies Archives team. Today I'm going to speak to you a little about today I'm going to speak to you a little about some of the questions, problems, realities, and causes of doing this work. And because for me, it is both personal and unfortunately institutional, there are no really easy fixes. And I think it's very important that we not pretend otherwise. So I'll start with the personal. This picture is me and my grandfather and the baby in his lap. And about a month ago, he turned 93 years old. He was born in Covington, Tennessee, and migrated to New York as an adolescent. And I mean migrated deliberately, but that's a different story for a different kind of conference. His own grandfather was born enslaved, and it was owned by the Smith family. His grandfather's name is Jacob Smith. When I told him about the kind of work that I was doing with Signing Ceremony, he said to me, well, that's your story too. And he told me that the land that he grew up on had been sold decades ago, and because the land had been belonged to his mother's family, many of his relatives were buried there. So he doesn't know what ever became of the grave of his mother and his sister and all of everyone else who was buried there. And he probably will never know. I don't know who owns that land now, and they don't know my family, and this is all speculation, but to them, these could just be fighting on their property. It could be a problem to be solved, or something to be covered up, some curiosity to show visitors, a haunting, a matter of appropriate storage, to quote the director of the Penn Museum, which of course brings me back to the work of Signing Ceremony. And during my archival work, searching for these ancestors in the archives, searching for the particular ancestors who were moved in January, means encountering a lot of ancestors at what must have been the worst times of their lives, when they were sick, impoverished, or eventually hunted by Morton. And so when I spend my time trying to locate traces of them in the archives, I'm reading thousands of traumatic experiences, one after the other. And if, like now we have HIPAA, and so it's unlikely in the future that anybody will see your name listed with all of your medical issues, unless you give them permission for that. But that's a very recent act for law, and all of our deaths, arrests, divorces, marriages, birth, all of those things will be how we will all be remembered by the state. And we all know that our lives are much more than that, and the same is true for our ancestors. And so that knowledge that is what I bring with me when I search for these individuals. So we're currently looking for the traits of those specific people, but that doesn't mean the other people that's worthy of my time. And even though there's no real dignity that I can give to them, still use my time to sit with them, read their names, and acknowledge that they existed, and that they're more than just their knowledge of the state. So a big question that I balance as a member of the Descendant community group and also the Archival Research Team is deciding what to share about these ancestors. So as I mentioned, in January, the Penn Museum moved some of them off-site, which was a new way to profit from their bodies and further their dehumanization. So in our efforts to restore some of that humanity, we handed out our own pamphlets at that event. And in it, this is the outside pamphlet. On the inside, we listed what we knew for sure about some of the people being moved. Maybe we can't really be sure whose bodies were moved when that said that they moved, because as we all know, that museum has been less than forthcoming about who all they were holding. But we tried our best, and we tried to remind people that these are human beings. And even with just our volunteer research group, we were able to offer more than just accession numbers, but not nearly enough for a eulogy. You can read the full list on the website, but I chose not to reproduce it today. So much of what we knew about their lives was pain, but we also knew things such as where they lived, where they traveled from, and if they were free, where they were free, only for a brief time. It's very difficult to find a balance of what to present and what to represent, of what to share and how to know when to share it. When I'm doing this research, the only real buffer that I have is what these institutions chose to record almost 200 years ago. And when I discuss what I find, I'm able to be that buffer. And I am interpreting this information and trying my best to consider the dignity and humanity of the people I'm speaking about, as well as people I'm speaking with. So when I speak with other members of the Descendant community group, we spend a lot of time and effort, explicit ask for consent and personal limits. When I'm doing my own research, I have to evaluate what I can hold at the time when I visit the archives and for how long I can hold it. And of course, these are big questions that I'm sure that many of you consider in your own work. Stay in here with you all. And I mean, I've been mixed company. I'm not an anthropologist, but I know most of you are. And I don't have the kind of job where I can influence what my institution does with the human remains in our care, but I know many of you do. And I know that the American Anthropological Association has convened their commission for the ethical treatment of human remains. And many of you are probably thinking about that report and the feedback and input that you would like to give, what you would like to bring back to your own home institution. And you'll be asking yourself questions about your work in your field and discipline at large, about who you're reporting to, who you're speaking to, who's the stakeholders, who's at risk, whose desires hold the most weight and power, who deserves what considerations and why. My personal academic training is in art history and museum studies, so I'm very familiar with the reality of working within field that exists as a project of white supremacy and trying to do good work from within that institution to, even though it built its own power on death, suffocation, humiliation. But the reality is that these structures and institutions cannot do this work. This work can be enormous, and it will not be done on a timeline, within a budget that pleases stakeholders. It took enormous effort to get us into its current mess. It will take enormous effort to try to repair, to even identify what it means to repair, and that's okay. That's the work of the Descendant community group, to honor our ancestors by filling in as much of their lives as possible based on the research and what we know to be true. We can look at these people and lay them to rest, not the institutions that harm them. Because to us, these not just bodies to be recorded and handled and moved, we are our ancestors. And that's another reason why I brought up my grandmother. As I mentioned before, the reality is that my name is Smith, her name is Smith, the name of people who own my ancestors, and that's not unique. Many people had their names stolen or replaced by conquerors, colonizers, enslavers, etc. And we are just, as I said, it's just the reality of being in the loop. And I have spoken a bit about how the state records us, so I will end my time with you by saying this. If you search for me in the Santa Cruz, California Superior Court records, my legal name change document. And in the section where I was asked to explain why I was changing my name, I've written changing last name due to burden of slavery. So even when I am long dead, my descendants will know that this was a burden that I felt we no longer needed to carry. So I put it down.
Jazmin? Lauren Nofi is our next panelist. Lauren is a disabled, queer, indigenous, Latinx archaeologist who focuses on community engagement and science communication for an archaeological field school in the UK. She also works at a major natural history museum as an educator, and she became a high school history and social studies teacher. And sorry, she is becoming a high school history and social studies teacher. She is a member of the genealogy team for Penn Museum.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. So yes, as you heard my introduction, I have multiple identities, and on a personal note, as an Indigenous person, ancestor care, ancestor treatment has been incredibly important, being passed down on that side of my family, but also on the European descendant side of my family. We are very, very, very heavily Catholic. And the work I do in the UK, you may think has nothing at all to do with the work we're doing here. There's not an Indigenous community that we are working with. But one of the other reasons is sort of a mix of that Catholicism and the medieval work that I'm doing in Northern England. There is a saint called Saint Cuthbert. He is what we would have termed Anglo-Saxon, but we don't use that term anymore. We usually say early medieval English. His body, after he passed away, was threatened by Vikings, and his descendant community, intellectually, in the monastic life, also possible biological descendants. Because remember, celibacy was not necessarily a thing in the medieval church. His descendant community risked their lives to transport his remains from a place where they could have been disturbed or desecrated. And they were willing to give their lives to move his remains. They went all over the north of England, and several of his descendant community died in the process, in altercations. Eventually, he was finally able to come to rest after many, many years at the Cathedral of Durham. If that descendant community can give their lives for the embodiment of someone they loved so much, the very least I could do is give my time. The very, very least. That is the lowest bar for me. So from that sort of context, the treatment of ancestors is very, very important to me. But also a personal connection from my father. My father was training as a clinical psychologist in Philadelphia in the 1980s, and he witnessed the moon bombing. When I told him that the work I was doing for Finding Ceremony related to 19th century ancestors also is intrinsically tied to the work to return the remains of those children murdered by the state to their families where they belong, he teared up. And it's very concerning to see an elder or a parent upset. It's one of the weirdest things you can witness. And all he could muster to say the first time we had this conversation was, good work. This is what needs to be done. And the impact that particular event had on him. He was in a program training that was training him in social and racial justice in the mental health field. The events of the moon bombing confirmed what he was starting to believe about the American police state. We've had conversations since about this. And I'm doing some of this work to help him find closure too. His trauma is not at all like the trauma of anybody in the Africa family. But I became more interested in the work involving Katricia and Delisha because of that personal connection that he had as well. And so that is why I'm involved. And how I got involved was around the end of 2022 when the Orphans Court petition was being made. And I happened to come across information on Twitter about this. And I joined the genealogy team. I backtracked to sort of understand what had gotten us to this moment. And so I became much more familiar with the early part of the timeline that you can see and that you can access on the worksheet or on the handout. What struck me is that this community group, this descendant community group that Penn organized was not honest or sincere from what I could tell. And I'm sure aAliy will speak more on the descendant community group that was formed to counter the descendant community group. I use air quotes on that, that Penn put together. If you look at the, or if you have a chance to look at the Recent Commission's report that the feedback session was for, there's a section that talks specifically about how descendant communities were worried about having token representation and people who were aligned with the institution that perpetrated the harm to be involved in the descendant community. And that was the thing that really disturbed me when I spoke further with aAliy and Lyra about the descendant community group. So my job as a trained anthropologist and archaeologist, I was trained in the United States, so I have that 4-field approach to archaeology. I'm very interested in community engagement. What was important to me is that there was a community that is not being listened to. And the least I could do was donate some of that time. And my job is to use my training to work through the extant materials, through the historical documents, if there ever are any material culture remains that are associated with the documents that we have. But I'm mostly working with the documents that Jazmin's team has gone through, and follow-up documentation that can be based on that. It's heavy work, it's emotional, and I am not even a member of the descendant community involved. So I cannot imagine the pain this causes for folks like Jazmin and aAliy, and looking at these records that we are finding and listening to the things that we are telling them. We are finding that a lot of the individuals that we are identifying are dealing with the intersection of poverty and physical or mental illness, in addition to enslavement. So these things are all very, very hard to work with, even as an outsider. But my job is to answer the research questions that the descendant community has. I keep my mouth shut otherwise. I know what I would do if these were my ancestors. And you know, I don't exaggerate to say that it's I would want someone doing this for my ancestors. I would want people organizing on behalf of my ancestors too. So whatever the descendant community wants of me, whatever they ask of me, I will do it. Even if it's not the questions that I would have asked, I will do whatever it takes to serve this descendant community. In my genealogical work, I was working mostly with the first named person we were able to identify. They are named in Morton's records, and I was able to, just by stroke of timing, I was crossing Pennsylvania. I live in Pittsburgh now. I was crossing Pennsylvania, going to New York City, and I was able to stop at the Chester County Archives and find information related to this individual. This man's name was John Voorhees. We issued a report about him and his ancestry in January of 2024. We were working on it for a while, but I was involved in the writing of that report. Some of the information that I found in the archive is included in the appendix of the report. But the thing that struck me, again, very disturbing, that Penn said that there was no more information we can get about these people, even though they had a name for at least one individual. They didn't bother to check all of the archival sources. They didn't even do a basic finding aid search for Chester County. They claimed that no further information could be found for these individuals, and that's demonstrably false. Because the first day, day one, I kid you not, day one, I sat and I hyperfixated, as someone with OCD does, and I went through every finding aid on the Chester County's website, on Chester County Records website, and I found very quickly that there were documents related to John Voorhees. And it was very strange to me that no one had come across this and they had claimed to have searched this archive. His name was spelled differently. We know that standardization and spelling of surnames especially is a very recent phenomenon. And no one had thought to Control F, so to the find function, go to the section for V in all of these finding aids and take the time to read through them. And I was able to find that his name was spelled Voorheis, and that's how he was recorded in the document. But then when I got my hands on the document, it was also spelled another way. And I feel like if any of you were able to attend that workshop here at the conference that was about doing archival research, I'm pretty sure, you know, somewhere in rule number 1 and rule number 2 is look for variant spellings. I am doing this from my computer in Pittsburgh on my very damaged futon. There is no reason that Penn Museum could not have found that same information. And so I was helping with the report. The particular documents I was looking at were a reply from Chester County to the Guardians of the Forest. We had a letter from the archives and then the reply to that letter. So we're slowly piecing together tiny bits of this gentleman's life. And the big conclusion that we found from some of the work that Lyra did at the very beginning when we got this gentleman's name is we realized that he is also Native American. And so he is subject to NAGPRA. We had hoped that that would be enough to get Penn to pump the brakes. They simply removed him from the list of individuals who are going to be married. And seeing how that piece of legislation is the one thing that saved him from being moved into storage, I don't know if there's a word strong enough for that. I was actually going to mention the same thing that Lyra mentioned about the quotes about appropriate storage. That's unconscionable. I work in a museum now. Some of the work I've done in Pittsburgh, I should make sure I'm not misleading anyone. I do not do archaeology for the Natural History Museum in Pittsburgh. I am a museum educator, but I have worked with the Egyptology department to fix signage about the removal of human remains, to prepare communities, to prepare the audience community to react to that. So I know what goes on in museums. I know, I've seen the things that go on in museums when it comes to human remains. So the comments about the mausoleum basically being a different storage location sent me into the stratosphere. It really did. These were people. These people mattered. They were brutalized and exploited in life and in death. They lived, they loved, they had favorite songs, they had a favorite meal. And as an archaeologist, whenever I find material objects, I tend to have an existential crisis. Holding something that's even, 50 years old that belonged to my grandmother, or something that came from the Bronze Age on the site where I work on in England, caused the same absolute unraveling of my comprehension. And basically, the documents that we were working with also had that effect, because we actually got to see some of the signatures, some people that were identified. And that was the thing that told me I'm doing the right thing. And in that sort of realization, I can hear the ancestors calling to me that this was the work we needed to do. We've had a little bit of luck sometimes go in our favor, and Lyra and I have discussed that the ancestors are watching out for us. But the last thing I would say, because I've rambled on and I've meandered a little bit, the last thing I'll say is that as anthropologists and archaeologists, we need to use our skills to serve descendant communities. This requires banishing our ego. We need to get rid of the paternalism. We have to uncoil these rotting tendrils of colonialism and racism. And it binds us to the crimes of our field. We can't ignore that. So even if I say, well, I wasn't involved in it, well, I'm in a museum now, so I have a role to play. I teach on a field school now that works with human remains. I have a role to play. We cannot be shifting responsibility for this repair. And these crimes of the field, they're still occurring right now, probably in your museum or in your university. And we need to seek solutions, even though there isn't one catch-all perfect solution. We need to seek them outside of the institution. And this is not just intellectual rigor, this is moral, this is ethics. Descendant communities have stepped up. When will we put our need for control aside? And I posit that time is now. It's long past, actually. But that time is right now, and I would implore you to choose to walk with us in this journey of supporting descendant communities. Yeah.
Lauren, I do want to recommission a couple of this, another book I think in terms to be discreet, not caught in the handout in the very back. So if you want to get and grab that now is a good time. And among other things that has a timeline on it, and you know, we're covering a lot of material here, so and a lot of different moments. Also, one other thing I wanted to clarify, because I didn't specify this before these talks, is what the research, why the research teams even exist, right? The research teams exist because at the first gathering of the descendant community group, I mean, that's actually technically was from the second. There was, you know, I shared what information we did know, what little information we didn't know already. So because Morton only reported the John fees, he did not report the other people that he collected from Philadelphia. There wasn't very much to go on. Right? And a lot of the information that we did have was, you know, how they died, the disease that they were diagnosed with, racial designation, which, you know, is not as secure as it might seem to be, and also the doctor who caught the skull for him. And obviously that's extremely deep. So that was one of the first requests that the descendant community group had, was to know more about who people were. And within a couple of months, we gathered these research teams to try to answer those questions, which is very, very long work. All right. So our next and final panelist is aAliy Mohammed, who is a cause writer born and raised in Philadelphia. In their work, they often problematize medical surveillance, discuss the importance of bodily autonomy, and center Blackness. aAliy is the creator of Black Reverence Chair, the Joy and Affirmation Ritual, and of course is also the Co-Convener of the final ceremony.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you to Lyra, to Jazmin, and to Lauren, and also Kathleen's here as well. I'm going to be very brief. I'm going to talk about my story and how I got connected to caring for ancestors. In 2019, I came across some kind of notice that Penn was holding a symposium hosted by the Penn and Slavery Project to look into Penn's complicity in the transatlantic slave trade. I went to this 2-day symposium and I heard about the Morton Cranial collection At the time, the modern cranial collection was on display in glass-fronted cabinets in an archaeology classroom in the Penn Museum. So when I heard that, I was really, really shocked as, you know, a Black person from the city. I never knew that was the case. So I started investigating and organizing to figure out what crania were there. And I learned that there were 50 African crania from Cuba. And so I created a change.org petition to call on Penn to return those remains in 2019, in April of 2019. And then I asked to write an op-ed about this in the Enquirer, which I wrote the same year. That's how I got called to working with ancestors. And then in 2020, Police Free Penn, which was an organization that formed after the murder of George Floyd, they included my demand and additional demands around the digital data collected from these remains to be, not used anymore, and then the crania to be returned. In 2021, there was an action organized by Police Free Penn and myself in front of Penn Museum on April 8th, which was the last day that a committee that was formed to look into the question of repatriating the modern cranial collection met. After that action, Penn said that they would return all the crania in the modern cranial collection. Within a week, I was told by someone close to Penn that Penn had remains of other ancestors who were recent ancestors. The remains of children burned and bombed in the MOVE bombing. I was really upset again at hearing about that, and I was one of 2 people to break that story in April of 2021. And then got connected with Lyra, and that's how, finding ceremony came to be. But I guess I want to emphasize the one thing I do want to say is that you're called to this work. I couldn't sleep at night. When I learned about the modern cranial collection, I couldn't believe that the response in the room was that this is normal. And I decided to take action, and that action led to other actions. And I feel deeply, deeply impacted by what I learned, and this is why I'm doing the work that I'm doing with the Black Philadelphians, the Descendant community group, and finding ceremony. So I just want to say that as a short kind of introduction, and definitely will speak more about this in the Q&A.
So much. Okay, so as I said at the beginning, we're going to take a bit of time now. If there are any questions that are specific questions for individual panelists, just to clarify a little bit more about it, and also that gives me I can answer questions as well. I see that we've got a number of people joining us on Zoom. So if you're on Zoom, you're welcome to put questions in the comment box, and I will read those out. So yeah, if anybody has any questions for the panelists.
What is there any thought of expanding this out to other museum collections? I know you're focusing on Penn Museum only right now, but obviously this is a problem that's much broader.
Yes, okay, so if anyone interested at this with a question about it, if any thought about expanding this other museum collection, because obviously the problem is much broader. You're absolutely right, it is extremely broad. It's literally everywhere, right? I mean, far more places than folks who don't work in museums can imagine, right? And I would say that a number of the people who are following us, including I'm noticing some of the folks who joined us on from other countries on Zoom right now, are of course engaged in that work in other places as well, both from the perspective of working, trying to pressure informal institutions, and also specifically trying to bring ancestors back home. Right? I believe that the model that we're working with is one that could work in a lot of places. We, as aAliy and myself, definitely don't have the capacity. I mean, we're doing this in addition to our regular lives, at this point, don't have the capacity to support or to lead them anywhere else. Although we are definitely working with and sharing information with, to the extent that we can, people who are engaged in similar projects elsewhere. But kind of by chance, again, we sort of didn't intend to develop this project in the way we have, but some of the feedback that we've received from folks is that this seems like a model for something that can happen in a lot of different places. It's just a matter of like, how do we, show that it's realistic, show that it can be done. And I think even just the practical work of the last couple of years has already shown the potential of it, even without funding, right? Even without levels of support that will be necessary to fully carry it out. So I mean, I really do hope that other institutions, not institutions obviously, but that it's developed for or around the collection of other institutions as well. The role of the institution, of course, being financial and also, returning remains rather than continuing to regard them and decide that they are parts of who they should go to. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
So I actually have a question. You guys mentioned how like the Penn Museum acquired the Morton cranial collection, but I was wondering how did the moon bombing victims end up in that collection, if you guys know?
Yeah, we do. At least for Confucian Research Remains. So, and it's not straightforward. So I'll tell you how I understand it. After the investigation ended, all of the people who followed, the 11 people who were murdered in the house, had been identified. But one professor from the University of Pennsylvania, AAliy, who was the advisor of Jazmin, who was the curator, Patricia's remains, and the curator of more collection as well. AAliy disputed the identifications of 2 of the people. He had been the first to try and do some form of identification immediately after the bombing. He brought in by the medical examiner's office to do that. He was not asked to keep on messing with it, but he did. And I want to say he made 5 identifications, and all of them were wrong. Or sorry, he made 5 of the identifications he made of the 11 people were wrong. In one case, he put the wrong head on the wrong body. Yeah. Sorry to be so graphic, but I just want to convey, like, he's a paleontologist, he had no business doing this. That was the assessment of one of his grad students who'd gone with him to do work, and he immediately left because it's like, he has no business doing this. His other grad student was Janet Mott, and she stayed in West Point. Anyways, the 2 of his misidentifications, the 2 that were the easiest to challenge because there weren't clear X-rays or very evidence that he was wrong, were those of the 2 children. And so we think it's ego. He's still alive. He's a professor emeritus at Princeton and refuses to talk to anybody about it. And Princeton alums, there was a movement to try and get his emeritus status removed. I don't know what the current status of that is. And so the assistant medical examiner who was in charge of the case, Robert Siegel, also alive, also refuses to talk to anybody. Basically gave him the remains even after the identifications had been made. And also sent them around the country for trying to get further support for AAliy's theory about the aging. And he was inaccurate. He sent them to California, he sent them to Connecticut, he sent them to the Smithsonian. And it was when they came back from the Smithsonian in September of 1986. Patricia's family thought they buried her in December of 1985. And Patricia's family thought that she was buried in September of 1986, but instead of September of 1986, some of her remains, and we believe essentially all of Alicia's remains that have been recovered were transferred to the Penn Museum from the Museum office for anthropological study, I think is what the thing says. We do have that. It's actually in my article that I showed to you. So that's the how. I mean, it's a really horrific thing, and it's completely inhumane, and it's impossible. It's not a real good answer.
I'd like to go back to the first question actually for a moment. Thank you. So, I just want to clarify that we're not doing this with the museum. They don't want us to be made it very clear that they did not want meetings. But I do think that other people in other places, like as we all said, this is not limited to just one institution. It's really an awareness problem, like about you mentioned, like being an adult and having lived in Philly their whole life and realizing that this is what from that museum. So I think that people who have this knowledge, like the burden is on them to get this information out there so that this in the community groups can get formed to figure out next steps. But it's not like a telling people what to do or how to do it. It's more like telling people what the problem is and then supporting them in their work to fix it.
We have a question that's come in on Zoom. I don't know, you might want to take this one. And it says, for an event as outrageous as the mood bombing and then the aftermath, including treatment of the remains, it seems to be largely missing from discussions of recent history and events. Could you share some insight on how this was erased from popular memory? Big question.
How the mood
How the mood bombing and also the remains happened with them.
I mean, a big part of it is white supremacy, anti-blackness. For me personally, the mood bombing will have a reaction in my mind by my mother. I was a child, I wasn't old enough to remember, but we lived in the same neighborhood as the mood bombing. And my mother told me about, what happened and how it felt in her body. So as a West Philadelphian who's Black, I can never forget what happened. I think in 2021, it reached a different level for me of how horrible the African family was treated in the aftermath. And, just the bombing itself in the aftermath in terms of how the remains were used at Penn. It made me so angry. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but I think it's the country's deep anti-Blackness, the history of Morton as well, but the history of Morton in Philadelphia makes it such that the mood bombing happened, right? This racist, doctor existed and collected remains in the 1800s. I think that history has a legacy to play as well with regards to the mood bombing.
Does anybody else have a question?
Thank you very much for bringing these problems to the attention of American Anthropological. I'm Michael Blakey. It is true that I coined the term descendant community 30 years ago for the purposes of an ethical bioarchaeology of informed consent at the African burial floor of Dr. Howard. And there, Black anthropologists led a multi-racial team to, and we define this as the package model, to only conduct research on remains if the descendant community was interested in the information that could be gotten about their history that was not available elsewhere. And they posed the question, so we held forums for over a year in Harlem downtown, so that their questions became part of our research design, and they could decide whether we did research or not. In the end, they approved that research and was heavily invested in. I think probably because it belongs to the continuous interaction with the extended community and service to it, and the creation of a national monument as a result. So now this is called the package model or model and model. I've been attentive to the development of descendant community ever since. My Institute for Historical Biology worked with more than a dozen descendant communities of African Americans as well as Native Americans as well as the courthouse in Minnesota to facilitate their full empowerment and to do research or not. Sometimes, in fact, we had a project for several years in Virginia to help memorialize, serve to help memorialize where we knew there would be needs. And then subsequently, I worked with the National Trust for Historic Preservation and had a chance to look at their 2018 rubric, which also defines the Descendant community consistently, but in most ways, with the way we did in the early 90s to get burial ground, and recently have been a co-chair of the Commission for the African Treatment of Human Remains of the American Anthropological Association. So I want to mention a couple of things, if I may, that that commission, for one thing, is comprised of half of us, the 10 are African American and mostly physical bioarchaeology. 2 are Native American, 1 is Asian, and 2 are Euro-American, all of whom have had long experience in working towards the ethical treatment of human remains. It is, in a way, a kind of intervention within anthropology. And so we brought together the long experience of all these folks. Rachel Watkins, who's now, I think, been put in the hot seat of being helpful from the inside to solve problems at the Penn Museum, was an undergraduate student of mine at Howard University working on the African burial ground with public engagement in the mid-1990s, a member of a commission. So we bring great deal of experience to it, went around the world, get the experiences and thinking and hearts of descendant communities, culturally affiliated groups everywhere that have informed this commission's report. And I just mentioned that among the many work to define descendant community, and I'll say something about that in a moment, very carefully, because it can be torn apart in ways that empower others. And what's most important about it is that the descendants, the social descendants of those who have the same social group as the ancestors in question, that they have the power of the stewardship of their remains. But one of the issues of the 6, so important that we made it one of the 6 principles, is the problem also of tokenization and other means by which the voice, the power of descendants is taken usually by white people or organizations that would serve to, assume the entitlement of having control, even if they have to use an occasional black person or a native person to do that. So we say this is unethical. It's our charge to define in many ways what is right and wrong, what is unethical, what is ethical. So I hope you will make use of the report to the extent that you can. I should say that the Penn Museum did not follow the advice that was given by me, Rachel Watkins, and others before it established its process. They say that a descendant community is defined as those a self-identified group of people, again, away from this possibility of focus, who are inclusive, bring in a broad range of possible descendants into the conversation as we become informed about remains, and then that is democratic. Therefore enabling to have moral authority and to make decisions of informed consent or declining consent. I would encourage that you think about, and maybe you have done these things, but I think you have not, that this kind of process really affords power. And finally, I said, the Penn Museum did not follow our advice. And I just, unfortunately, just want to say something that may be a little controversial, but it's important. From those, and I'm glad to learn what I've learned today, from those of the outside, like myself, we don't always know what's going on with it. Because, Dr. Monteiro, it is not clear that the descendant community is leading. And it is sometimes possible to lead from behind, but it is impossible to follow from the front. And I would like you all to think about how you present yourself and how you construct the authority, the moral authority that you should have.
Thank you, Dr. Blakey. I want to respond to the last bit about if the descendant community is in control or leading from the front. I think a big part of the reason why the other members of the descendant Black Philadelphians descendant community haven't been as visible is because of the ways that Penn harms people who make themselves public. I've been very public about my position about Penn. But there's a lot of people who are afraid of retaliation. And that's a big part of why there's a very slow process in terms of what we share publicly about who is in the descendant Black Philadelphians descendant community group. That was very strategic because if people felt like they could be, challenged by the institution. And for example, I was sued for writing a piece about the move remains by Penn anthropologists. So a lot of the members of the Black Philadelphians descendant community group also knew that. And so for those reasons, it's been a slow process of making ourselves known. I mean, we wrote a letter to Penn Museum, to the NAPRA person there, and I had signatures of people in the Black Philadelphians descendant community group. That letter was not shared publicly with the signatures, but there is a group of Black Philadelphians who are concerned and care for these ancestors, and we're trying to figure out a way to make ourselves more public and do that in a way that doesn't cause more harm to people.
I think I should also say that to the point of moving from rather following from the front, here's the thing. Finding Ceremony is not an organization about Black Philadelphia. Finding Ceremony is a project that's about the entire Mountain Island collection, in which I also have ancestors. In this moment, we don't think it's responsible to try and spread the awareness that's necessary to form descendant community groups for my ancestors. Well, because we don't have the funding, right? We don't have the resources yet. The only group that exists is the Black Philadelphians descendant community. I also think that it depends on who you are, Dr. Blakey, who you're following, whose work you're paying attention to. I know that academics probably see me more than they see, for example, aAliy. But people at aAliy's community, Black Philadelphians, definitely see aAliy more than they see me. So I think that, that's just the reality of the different spaces that people are in. Thought there was another question, but there wasn't another. Any other questions specific to, actually, you know what, I just realized that we're short on time. I want to make sure that we have time for Kathy's comment, and then no, please. So before we move on. All right, so Kathy Finder is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology and Gender and Women's Studies at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. She received degrees in anthropology from DePauw University and the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. At FLC, she served as Anthropology Department Chair and as coordinator of the Gender and Women's Studies program. She was a faculty affiliate of the Native American and Indigenous Studies program and served until 2021 as FLC's NAGPRA compliance officer. She continues active NAGPRA scholarship as well as collaborative research with an Indigenous community in Quito, Ecuador. She has authored and co-edited several articles and books, including Urban Mountain Beings, History, Indigeneity, and Geographies of Time in Quito, Ecuador, And I'm gonna skip down among all of these books to the one that, that has been particularly, valuable and inspirational for our work, which is, Grave Injustice, the American Indian Movement and NAGPRA, which it looks like the second edition is under revision right now. When was the first edition?
2002.
2002, yeah. Kathy serves as secretary of the Association of Senior Anthropologists for the AAA, as a board member of both the Colorado Fulbright Association and the Mesa Verde Association, and as a member of the Durango Association of University Women's Leadership Team.
Thank you. I was really honored to be invited to be discussant for this panel. And we have very little time left, and I think that time should be dedicated to the panelists answering questions. I'm very glad that Dr. Blakey spoke. And so I got prepared remarks. Usually when you're a discussant, you read people's papers ahead of time and make remarks, and this isn't that kind of panel. So what I was saying in these remarks is that because the panel is partly about being an outsider and about expertise, and I'm not a cultural anthropologist, and so I have experienced being treated as an outsider, that you're not an archaeologist, you're not a museum specialist, what are you doing talking about NAGPRA, go back, just work in South America. But I think it's very important, and I think that's one thing that I found really exciting about the commission, is that there's a diverse people with diverse disciplinary backgrounds. And I think we have to keep working in that direction. I have some remarks focused on NAGPRA and the non-communication. So here are the repatriation laws for the Smithsonian and for NAGPRA were passed 40 years ago, practically 35 years ago, and it's still not done. And basically what those laws are about are three things: 3 elementary feats of strength: documentation, consultation, and repatriation. And it's still not done. There's still 90,000 individuals that have been reported in museum holdings that have not, the process hasn't gone through. There's been a tremendous, just this past year, tremendous wave of activity, kind of convergence between what the commission has done, the new regulations that just came out in NAGPRA that help museums do their work better, and more importantly, help tribal nations and Native Hawaiians have more control over what's going on. And these sorts of things are important. Deb Holland's work on the residential boarding schools, Joe Biden's apology. This convergence is uplifting at a time when the elections turned out the way that they did. And so I see this work, and I see the commission's work as extremely important. But I think what's most important in terms of this panel and the work of Finding Ceremony and the Descendant group is that it's like a canary, they're like a canary in the mine. So there's these wonderful work, the African Burial Project. We heard yesterday from Antoinette Jazmin about her work with the Black Cemetery Network. But if there's still individuals who are not happy, feel they're not being listened to, feel like gaslighting is going on, and more importantly, as Lauren said, they're not doing due diligence in basic research to find information about ancestors. Because as somebody who works in NAGPRA, it's very disturbing to me that burials or Chip Caldwell talks about the secrecy of museums, that expertise is really tied to secrecy and smoke and mirrors, and that hides the possibility that there are ancestors of diverse backgrounds, especially Native American. It takes a village, as they say. It takes the work of different disciplines, different backgrounds, and especially a dedicated grassroots group to get this work done. I made some comments about that what this work does as well is that, and I'll just jump ahead, complex and often heartbreaking matters of treatment of, respect for, and return of the dead require true consultation, true listening, and true collaboration with descendants and allies. We all agree about that, acting in good faith. But secondly, Finding Ceremonies experiences suggest that recommendations provided in the TCTHR report still need some work. So listening sessions are going on. You can all, there's a website where you can go in and make comments and responses to the recommendations. And I know from talking with people that one recommendation, one thing floating around is that it's not just enough to talk about ethical treatment. Repatriation needs to be more front and center in some way, like how it's about also the return of individuals, and maybe that could be stronger somewhere in the report. And then finally, the frustrations faced by finding ceremony in Philadelphia at the hands of the Penn Museum and Philadelphia Orphans Court causes us or suggests that it's time to return to discussions regarding national legislation that goes beyond the stalled HR 6805, the African American Burial Grounds Preservation Act. And Dr. Blakey, do you happen to know, I mean, that was stalled, I think, in 2022 on the House floor. Is that going to come back to life, the African American Burial Grounds Preservation Act?
Currently, it was passed for 2 or 3 years, hasn't been funded. Now, how is that?
It has been funded?
Has not been
Has
funded.
not been
It
funded.
was passed with
Okay.
the ending in 2 or 3 years, but it's a nothing.
Yeah, that's, so, I'll just end with this. I mean, when they invited me to be part, Lyra invited me to be someone to consult with them regarding perhaps in what ways can some legislation for Native Americans with NAGPRA be useful in thinking about what's really a much more complex issue when you don't have federal laws and you're trying to get justice accomplished. And so I've learned more from them than they have from me. But I end by saying we can do no worse than to listen carefully to and take seriously the work of the finding ceremony and descendant community groups as we continue to suggest recommendations made in the ethical treatment of human remains. More importantly, for this group and many others in the Philadelphia area, pathways must be created along which not only the human beings alienated in the Morton collection, but also and especially the children of the Africa families can find their ways back home through ceremonial and axiological research, repatriation, and a sense of irreconciliation. Irreconciliation means we never say it's over. We never reconcile ourselves to saying our work is done. It's all good. My president used to, at college I worked at, I used to say, when is NAGPRA done? When are we? He's like, it's never done. And he's like, well, what am I paying you? And I said, you're not paying me. I'm doing this volunteer. Oh yeah, that's right. And so this work must and will continue, fueled by the righteous heartbreak and yearning towards light out of the historical racism and violence that's made America anything but great in its darkest moments. Thank you.
Thanks. So gonna open up for questions and discussion a little bit more. Again, if you come in and haven't gotten my handout, there's handouts in the back, please grab one. They do have the timeline and I'll have the name. Okay.
It's sorry.
Want to ask a question? Thank you.
My name is Jessica Mashima. I was born in New York, and I went to the Mr. Ali Mohammed. Yeah. And on the timeline, the April 2019, Ali Mohammed called for the number scouts of black people who died in the Israel community in Cuba.
Yes.
Just the scout that remained came back to the Cuba community or not is the first question. And also the number two is also because of the same the table time to try. April 2021, Penn Museum apologized for their unethical position of the motive and colonial reflection. To whom the Museum apologized about the motive reflection because inside within the motive reflection, Jukia also didn't include the reflection. This is the number two question.
Well, I'm sorry, what was the first part of that question about 2019?
Yeah. That's the demand that died in Cuba.
Have they been returned?
Yeah.
No, they have not been. They're still in the basement of the Penn Museum. Those remains of spring in. And then the second part of your question, in terms of Penn apologized to the wind. I mean, they didn't specify who they were apologizing to. They just made a public apology for having the Morton cranial collection, and that they were going to return those remains. That was recommended to them by the first Morton cranial collection committee that was formed in 2020 after the racial reckoning in the U.S.
And there's some difficulty determining the remain of Cuba.
You said, is it difficult?
What the difficulty is determining the remain of Cuba?
So I can probably speak to this. So basically, the Penn Museum has not returned remains from the Morton cranial collection to anybody.
Yeah.
Anywhere.
Yeah.
It's not that there's a difficulty specifically about the human remains. Yeah. AAliy made a demand as an outsider, but they don't care about demands. Things may change, we'll see. But I wonder if somebody might be able to pose the board. Because people,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm organizing the next step.
our session ends at, oh, right, I'm sorry. You've gone over, I'm so sorry. I had my head at 2:45. I really apologize. Oh, never mind then. I will answer your question more though, later. Please, anyone feel free to ask any questions that you have. I'm so sorry for losing track of the time. And again, there's handouts in the back. If you have any questions, you can also find our mailing list on our website, which is findthesarahmoment.com.
All right, and because we ran out of time to hear Dr. Kathleen Finder's full remarks as our discussant for our panel, she's agreed to record those separately for us now, and really looking forward to hearing them.
Thank you very much. These remarks are pretty close to what I had intended to give at the meetings, and they were designed to fill probably 12 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes. But they're also, because I prepared remarks and then I made notes on what panelists had said, and now I've incorporated my reactions to a couple of those remarks in here. So I'll just read this. I was honored, if somewhat surprised, to be invited to serve as discussant for this session, as I am not a forensic anthropologist, a student of Philadelphia history, a member of an Afro-descendant community, or a museum specialist. Yet I suppose it makes sense, not only because I've been working in the area of NAGPRA compliance since the 1990s, and that's the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, but also because I embody something of what it means to question the trope of disciplinary control when dealing with matters close to the hearts of individuals and communities that have experienced violence, silencing, and dismissal of painfully felt concerns on the grounds of being not expert enough. The problematic issue of disciplinary control and expertise is a familiar one to those who conduct repatriation work, scholarship, and activism, but may not have academic or technical training in the gatekeeper arenas of archaeology, CRM, forensic osteology, or museology. But whatever frustrations and firewalls that non-authorized academics and technicians may feel at being kept outside consultation arenas are nothing compared to the experiences of members of descendant communities who are deemed not legitimate enough, sincere enough, or expert enough to be invited to the table to discuss the treatment and fate of individuals and objects held in museums to which they feel not only affiliation, but obligation to protect or even rescue from additional harm. The wall of non-communication connected to non-compliance is something that NAGPRA practitioners and interested parties have been beating their heads against since federal laws were passed in 1989 and 1990, enjoining the Smithsonian and all other federally funded institutions to accomplish 3 elementary feats of strength: document, consult, repatriate. And yet, as elegantly elementary these requirements may be, they have, going on for 4 decades, been sidestepped in whole or part, leaving, as the most recent statistics from the National NAGPRA program report, and despite criminal penalties for noncompliance built into the statute, and despite dramatic increases in process completion over the past couple of years, They have left more than 90,000 individuals waiting on shelves to be repatriated and rematriated home. The 90,000 number, which represents 58% of those reported, does not reflect those individuals not reported and about which we can only guess. Even the searchable ProPublica database indicating which museums are in compliance and which are not takes off the hook federal facilities that may have incompletely reported their holdings, leaving everyone in the dark. And this begs the even more horrifying question of what human remains languish in private homes, collections that are not federal, and back alley garages. If the repatriation process has been frustratingly glacial for Native peoples and their allies and other diligent, if overworked and underpaid museum and THPO, that's Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, who work within frameworks of federal law with elaborate and very recently updated regulations, how might repatriation firewalls feel to non-Native American descendant communities who fall outside the aegis of legally mandated repatriation laws and whose ancestors are blocked from them by thick walls of racist histories and practices embedded in institutional modus operandi? To address this gap within academia, professional organizations like the Society for American Archaeology, the Association for Biological Anthropology, and the American Anthropological Association have created ethical statements that have evolved over the past decades, culminating in the recent report of the Commission for the Ethical Treatment of Human Remains, which seeks to address the silences, abuses, inconsistencies, and general murk regarding how to treat the dead, not only in the US, but also globally. This report came out practically in tandem with the 2024 revised NAGPRA regulations, accompanied by in-depth reporting provided at long last by ProPublica and other news agencies regarding repatriation, by Secretary Haaland's initiatives to investigate long-neglected U.S. residential boarding school atrocities, and by President Biden's recent apology to Native peoples for this piece of U.S. assimilationist and genocidal policy. This burst of activity and awareness may be too little, too late for many, but for those of us who've been in the repatriation trenches for decades, it has created a sense of optimism, a feeling of some accomplishment, and a hope that things can only get better from here on. The explosion of hires into repatriation positions, precarious and poorly paid, though I imagine the majority of them are, the regular conversations in nationwide NAGPRA communities of practice, the Wintergren-funded visits to individuals and groups around the globe to discuss issues related to treatment of the dead, and many other actions and initiatives suggest that we may be in a time of sea change regarding the colonialist possession, storage, display, destruction, disrespect, and dehumanization of the bodies of exhumed, stolen, and murdered individuals. Or are we? The experiences of at least one community, the Black Philadelphians Descendant Community Group, whose relentless work we have learned something about this afternoon, is something like a canary in the mine of all these and other good works carried out by organizations ranging from the African Burial Grounds Project, spearheaded by Dr. Michael Blakey from the College of William and Mary, who is in attendance at this session, to the amazing work carried out by the Black Cemetery Network, founded by Dr. Antoinette Jackson of the University of South Florida here in Tampa. Despite the progress, if slow, made by other organizations concerned with the just disposition of the remains and associated funerary objects of Black Americans, the experiences of the Black Philadelphians Descendant Community Group, who form part of the Finding Ceremony activist umbrella that has as its ultimate goal the transfer of the Samuel George Morton collection, now held by the University of Pennsylvania, remind us that any optimism, sense of relief, or even vindication we might feel needs to be constantly animated by critical awareness, humility, skepticism, and historical realism. If one group of highly motivated individuals of very diverse backgrounds finds its message to be so important that it chooses to raise its own funds to travel to Florida to speak to anthropologists in the hope that doing so might affect some change, then we need to listen well. three issues rise to the surface for purposes of my remarks today. First, the crux of the matter, as Dr. Lyra.d.monteiro explained succinctly in a March 4th, 2024 letter to the Philadelphia Inquirer, written in response to an opinion piece published on February 27th by the Williams director of the Penn Museum, Dr. Christopher Woods, is that museums seem to think that only two possibilities exist regarding legacy collections: to either rebury them or to keep them, and to presumably try harder if they're keeping. A third option, that of transferring the remains to a descendant group who will provide respectful and ceremonially informed care financed by the offending institution, seems to be unthinkable. Turning the unthinkable to the thinkable, however, has motivated members of the BPDCG, the Black Philadelphians group, as well as the broader finding ceremony community, to do something unusual, as I said earlier, to bring its story and concerns to the American Anthropological Association meetings, to inform an interested audience and answer questions regarding the ways that the disposition and treatment of murdered MOVE victims from the Africa family since 1985 connect to a global collection that has been amassed since the 19th century in a period of intense scientific racism, and that's the Morton collection. The panelists also discussed their individual motivations and described ways they have applied their own skills as art historians, archaeologists, archivists, oral historians, journalists, biological anthropologists, and museum workers to address information gaps that should long ago have been filled by Penn Museum and anthropology staff doing their own work. Although Director Woods averred that the interment of 20 Afro-descended Philadelphians into a research-accessible mausoleum in Eden Cemetery was justified on the grounds that it was very unlikely that any biographical information could be found regarding individuals whose body parts were collected by Morton, the finding ceremony team has disproven his statement by carefully conducting its own research. In addition, while Dr. Woods invokes the NAGPRA statute when he says that reburial should ethically occur with dispatch and not be delayed by promises of further documentation, thus addressing the first principle of NAGPRA I mentioned above, to document, he ignores two additional central factors of that statute: to consult with all potentially culturally affiliated parties and to repatriate to culturally affiliated groups based on meaningful and complete consultation. Penn Museum's creation of its own consultation group to make decisions regarding cultural affiliation and repatriation reburial is not acceptable practice under the NAGPRA statute. Again, while NAGPRA is not legally applicable to individuals in the Morton collection who are not from North American Indian, Native Alaskan, or Native Hawaiian tribal nations, it should not be invoked. The statute should not be invoked in part and incorrectly to justify a difficult situation. A second and related issue is that the experiences of the Black Philadelphians descendant community, connected as they are to disappointing and mendacious treatment by some members of the anthropology staff at Penn regarding the MOVE victims' remains, suggests that the recommendations provided in the report produced by the AAA Commission on the Ethical Treatment of Human Remains still need much clarification and refinement. The commission is currently conducting listening sessions and has produced a survey asking for anonymous responses to the recommendations. And I recommend that all of you go into that document and make your own comments. Finally, the frustrations faced by finding ceremony at the hands of the Penn Museum and the Philadelphia Orphans Court suggest that it is time to return to discussions regarding national legislation that goes beyond the stalled H.R. 6805, the African American Burial Grounds Preservation Act, and NAGPRA-like addresses museum holdings with an emphasis still not present even in the TCE-THR, the Human Remains document, on return and repatriation, and not just on the crucial but insufficient notion of ethical treatment. In other words, we should put more teeth into recommendations that include offering sincere apologies providing confirmation of consent, creating organizational schemes that facilitate identifying those with whom to consult, quote, removing structural barriers to dignity for human remains. These are all recommendations from the document from the commission, and committing, quote, to a hard pause on research that does not have informed or descendant community consent, either from lineal descendants, descendant communities, or culturally affiliated groups. That's from page 35 of that report. Again, these are essential recommendations, but ones that have not yet been extended to the finding ceremony researchers, activists, descendants, and allies. In other words, they don't quite apply. As was suggested yesterday in at least one presentation given during the double session on osteology without bones, it is difficult to identify just who is a legitimate community, descendant or otherwise, with whom a museum or other curatorial facility should interact in resolving difficult matters regarding forensic and legacy collections of human remains. This makes it even more incumbent upon academic institutions to extend its powers of consultation and listening and its financial resources to genuinely include the abolitionist, decolonial, humane spirit of reparations and repatriation work. To return to Penn and setting individual staff members and their behaviors aside, motivations for which I have no access, I still must ask, what would lead a Department of Anthropology well-versed in the white supremacist legacy of 19th century racial science, especially based as it was hugely in Philadelphia area, to build a modern classroom in which crania visibly hold court where the spirits of departed ancestors, such as Agassiz and Morton, seem to displace the spirits of their original owners. It is painful for me to speak these words for many reasons. I've long felt a connection to the University of Pennsylvania because of professional relationships I had to some faculty members and curators. I respected their collaborative, even groundbreaking repatriation work of Native Americans, and I invited two anthropology faculty members to a session I organized at my own college, centered on having dialogues with Native American archaeological colleagues about how archaeological work could and must be collaborative, with Native voices always guiding decision-making. So when I was invited to consult with the Finding Ceremony project, I was therefore baffled and even a bit resistant. And I just want to say I was invited to participate through an invitation from Dr. Chip Caldwell in 2022, who introduced me to lyra.d.monteiro. This is Penn. They would never do this, I was thinking to myself. But we all know that institutions, like human beings themselves, are full of contradictions and the detritus of history. Was it not the same University of Pennsylvania that hosted a virtual international conference in 2021 on the topic of settler colonialism, slavery, and the problem of decolonizing museums? And is it not Penn that on its website it currently enjoins a global public to explore our shared humanity and listen to Native American voices? So what went wrong? And how does this provide lessons that can be applied to other institutions? And perhaps more importantly, what has and can still improve, hopefully because of a new wave of professionals at many museums who now listen and respond more carefully than perhaps they once did. This is a time where anthropological thought and practice has turned its attention to addressing and overturning its colonialist history, perhaps more than ever. I've been attending these meetings, these AAA meetings, for more than half my life, and I've never seen so many non-white, non-male faces presenting papers in sessions and walking the hallways. A young Black Haitian anthropological research scholar pursuing her PhD in Africana Studies at Emory University told me yesterday that she's never felt as welcome as she now does within the AAA. She said this is because she feels the tide has truly turned and that maybe her work can make a genuine difference. I don't know, we had an election recently that may turn things around, but in this decolonial, disciplinary, self-critical moment, we can do no worse, we can lose no ground, and we can only improve the communicative landscape of trust between museums and the public than to listen carefully to and take seriously the work of Finding Ceremony and the Black Philadelphians Descendant community group. It will not be an easy task. As panelist and Descendant community member Jazmin Benton stated a moment ago, it will take an enormous amount of energy to even know what it would mean to repair the damage caused by the University of Pennsylvania, which has treated her relatives as less than human for a very long time. Idealistic and even disturbing though the goals of finding ceremony must appear to some academics who cannot imagine the third option presented and forwarded by finding ceremony, but rather want to proceed ethically along new pathways of respect, we must still work together and listen to one another to find ways back home through ceremonial and axiological research, repatriation, and a sense of irreconciliation. A viewpoint that's open to change, but not to accepting narrowly defined academic expertise as the last word in achieving decolonial abolitionist justice. My hope is that the courage demonstrated by the panelists today and in their ongoing work will not further injure them as they seek recognition, respect, and employment, and that the punitive and dismissive treatment already experienced by some will come to a complete halt. This work must and will continue, fueled by the righteous heartbreak and yearning towards light out of the historical racism and violence that has made huge swaths of American history and goals toward equality anything but great. Thank you.
Thank you so, so much for sharing that really powerful, thought-provoking, and moving statement, Kathy. And again, I apologize to you and for everyone who was in the room on Friday, for us running out of time, which was definitely on me as the chair, for us running out of time to hear it all then. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.